It's News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome to the Marc Kapetan Show. This is attorney Marc Kapetan, your host. Today's show is brought to you by the Kapetan Brothers Law Firm, serving the Central Valley since 1995. If you or anybody you know has been injured in an auto accident, a truck accident, or a motorcycle accident, give us a call at 559-498-8000. Or if you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, call us 559-498-8000. Kapetan Brothers, we are the Valley's law firm. Folks, we are doing a second segment of a show with our last week's guest, Ken Khachigian, who is the speechwriter for Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and Dan Quayle. Let me sort of recap here. Ken was gracious enough to allow us some more time so that we could get his whole story out. So we taped another segment last week, and we're playing it for you today. After graduating law school, our next guest wrote a letter effectively to President Nixon's basically campaign at the time that he was running for president. And in response, he basically stated, I would like to help on the campaign. And over the next 20 years became not only a campaign and staff member, he became one of the head writers for President Reagan and for other basically political figures, including Richard Nixon. Most of our time last time was spent talking about Richard Nixon, and a lot of today is going to be spent talking more about Ken and Ronald Reagan. So again, please welcome back to the show, Ken Khachigian. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
Listen, Ken, we were talking when we left off last time about your family and your family emigrating from Armenia, and let's bring up the favorite topic of all of Fresno, and that is Governor George Deukmejian. You were part of his campaign, and were you a speechwriter for Governor Deukmejian?
Well, I did some speeches for him. Mainly, I was a political advisor and strategist, and helped in his 82 and 86 campaigns. And what's interesting is how I met him was, of course, I knew him by reputation in the Armenian community when he was a state senator. I was at the 68 Republican convention on a shuttle bus going to the convention hall. And I was sitting in the back there, and I saw George and Gloria about 4 seats ahead of me, and I tapped him on the shoulder, and I introduced myself. And so he said, "Why don't we have breakfast?" And that's how we met each other. And then later on in years, as he went up in higher office and ran for Attorney General, I helped just a little bit, but then finally in 82, I got very active in his campaign and helped him win the governorship in 82, and then in 86 was one of the principal strategists again to help him become governor, reelected governor. So he had two great terms as governor, and I think he was one of the finest governors we had in California.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I'm
Attorney General as well, as you know.
Yeah, Attorney General. Yeah, exactly. I'm friends with one of his staff members, Rob Soroyan, who was a former staff member of his, and also very good friends with Rob, and also very good friends and very close with his son, George Deukmejian Jr. The most surprising thing was not only his law and order and his sense of responsibility to the people, but it's my understanding that he actually turned down what would have probably been a very, very good shot at running for president of the United States.
Well, there was a lot of talk about George running for president and also being Attorney General of the United States and being on the ticket as vice president, but really he had no interest, I think, and he didn't want to leave California. He had a strong family here. He was a family man. I think for a lot of the same reasons I didn't want to go permanently in the White House under President Reagan, and I think he just he didn't have that overwhelming driving ambition to claw his way up. I think that a lot of people do in politics.
That's an interesting thing that you state, because do you find, in comparing and contrasting a great leader like George Deukmejian, one who was very much involved in politics, and similarly great leaders in Reagan and Nixon, although believe me, I'll get a backlash on social media about that because there's going to be a lot of people who disagree. Do you find that there was a difference in their personalities, and you sort of identify that they have this overwhelming ambition to claw their way to the top, etc.? And I know you don't mean that in a bad way, but do you find that there's a personality trait when you talk to these people, and you were very close with some of them, that there is an ambition that is just built into the person that you didn't find in George Deukmejian?
Well, everybody has a different sense of how they want to contribute to their country. And in George's case, he had a very strong sense of law and order. And when he wanted to become Attorney General, he believed that crime was out of control in California. And then he felt that he was stifled as Attorney General. He couldn't get things done. So that's the only reason he wanted to run for governor. Yeah. And then as governor, he found that he could, was getting a lot of things done that he couldn't get done as Attorney General. But he just didn't feel it necessary to go further. President Nixon felt that he could make a big change internationally because he had a big brain. He had big understanding of the world. This is a man who spent time with Winston Churchill and Nehru and Eisenhower and all the great leaders of the world. And he had a great grasp of international affairs, and he wanted to make a contribution in that sense. So he felt the only place he could do that was in the presidency. And Ronald Reagan was similar. And Reagan felt that the only way he could change the culture and to make government smaller and to make so that there was less taxation and to get government off the backs of people is to run for president. Yeah. So each one had a different mission, and to fulfill that mission, they did it in a different way.
I told George Deukmejian's son one day, I said, can you imagine that out of the 20 some or however many millions of people who were in California at the time, that your father believed that he was the only one who could solve the problems, right? And we were saying it sort of as a joke, but there has to be something. Did you see in these people an ego, or did you see a dedication to public service that they truly, listen, Ronald Reagan was an actor making a lot of money and had made a lot of money throughout his career, and you sit there and you go, why would you give it all up? Is it ego, do you think, or is it really this sense of, I want to make America a better place?
Well, it's a combination. You have to have some ego to run for office, or you're not going to do it. You have to be competitive, and you have to want to win. It doesn't matter, who you are. Nobody's bashful about winning, and everybody's got a strong ego. Ronald Reagan would look like, he didn't have much of an ego, or he looked self-effacing, but he was a very, very tough competitor. Right. He would tell stories in Hollywood of being competitive with some of the other actors that some of these stories, it would take me too long to tell, and I don't want to take up your time, but
no, that's okay.
He had a very big, strong streak of competition in him, and he could get his dander up, believe me, when he would hear the Democrats attack him. So there was an ego as well as a desire to really make a big change in America and get things done. And he was a strong anti-communist in an era when communism was a big threat to the world.
Yeah. Believe me, it seems to come every 20 years or 30 years or so, too.
Oh, starting again.
Yep, starting again, I know. When it comes to the egos and stuff, and you say everybody has an ego, as a speechwriter, you never had a chance to stand up in front. You may have, but you're not giving the speech yourself. Does it take an ego for you and the speechwriting team to be able to write those words down? Do you actually sit there and picture yourself giving those speeches? What is the process of putting those words to paper, and how much of it is you coming out and your ego coming out, and how much of it is you writing the speech for the president?
Well, I try to get into his head. Obviously, look, nobody elected me to anything, so it's not my job to press the message or to press an agenda. And I always felt that way. And I tried very hard. I was small fish with President Nixon, but I was chief speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, so I had a big responsibility.
Right.
And in doing so, I paid attention to what his needs were and to what his policies were, and I tried to be very faithful to it. I found other staff members who tried to get me to write words that they wanted instead of what the president wanted, and I resisted that. And now, that's not to say that I didn't try to shape the words in such a way as to make them persuasive,
right.
But it also meant that I didn't try to put policies in his mouth that weren't his.
Right. We're going to be right back with Ken Khachigian. He was the speechwriter for President Nixon, the head speechwriter or main speechwriter for President Reagan. Very, very interesting conversations. Folks, I want you to tune in right after this. This is the Marc Kapetan Show on KMJ. News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome back to the Marc Kapetan Show. Folks, I'm going to pot this music down as I like to do on the second segment. If you have been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, please call your local attorney. If you've been injured in an auto accident, a truck accident, or a motorcycle accident, call your local attorney. Your local attorney knows best. Call the Kapetan brothers, 559-498-8000. Do us a favor. Do yourself a favor. I know it's a very trying time and you don't know what to do. I'll tell you, we know what to do. Kapetan brothers have been doing this for 30 years now. So if you need some help and you've been arrested or you've been in a serious accident or you have a friend who's been in a serious accident, please give us a call. 559-498-8000. 559-498-8000. Kapetan Brothers, we are the Valley's law firm. We are back on with Ken Khachigian. He is the speechwriter. He was the speechwriter for President Nixon and President Reagan. You were talking about President Reagan and your work with him. You were basically the primary. Were you the head speechwriter for him?
Well, for the time, the brief time I was in the White House, full time, yes, I was chief speechwriter. And then the way I worked it with him is when I came back to California, we made an agreement that I would come back and forth to help him on speeches from time to time. And then I called myself the fireman. When they had a brush fire and a need for special assistance, they would call me back to Washington. So I flew back and forth several times during his entire 8 years to work on special assignment. So I was chief speechwriter for the first 3.5 months of his administration, and then I would get called in on a special assignment. And then full-time again for the 84 campaign, I spent 5 months back in Washington traveling with him on Air Force One throughout the campaign. And then special occasions like working on the speech before the General Assembly in 1985 or 1986 when he and Mr. Reagan did that speech for Just Say No on drugs, or the 1987 State of the Union speech, things like that. They would call me back for special assignment to help out.
Let me ask you, because that was one of the questions I had. The Just Say No, we were talking on the last segment about his individual responsibility and your sense of individual responsibility coming maybe from your parents and grandparents, etc. The Just Say No campaign, number one, how did it come up? But also, it seemed like it got so blasted in the media and by the liberal side of politics, and I could never understand that even as a kid back then, because even though it may be a bigger problem, even though the war on drugs and everything had much deeper issues that they were facing, the fact that they came out with this simple line of just say no gave everybody and the young kids at the time a sense of personal responsibility, which was everything the Reagans were all about, personal responsibility. How did that come about? How did you guys go about promoting it? And what was the resistance that you personally saw from the media and from the liberal press?
Well, I wasn't deeply involved in the whole campaign. I was, because Mrs. Reagan was going to be involved in delivering the speech, and jointly with President Reagan, they were comfortable in working with me, the two of them. And so they asked me to come back and work with the two of them on the speech. And I think part of it was there was a lot of Washington can be a very cynical place, and there was a lot of cynicism towards Mrs. Reagan, wondering if she was sincere about her activities, and so I just think there was maybe even a phony sense of attacking her on this, and feeling that she wasn't into it for the right reasons, but she really felt very dedicated to this matter, and I wish that it had taken hold even more than it did. So, but I wasn't there to try to implement it, I wasn't a staff person trying to be involved with it. But I'll tell you one good source for people who are interested in this to follow up. The Reagan Library has a lot of information on this. And for those who haven't been to the Reagan Library to see this, they should go. And I'll say the same thing for the Nixon Library.
Right.
I was on the board of directors of the Nixon Library for 25 years. Both of those libraries have enormous resources for people who are interested in those two administrations. They're fascinating places to visit. In Simi Valley for the Reagan Library, and for Yorba Linda, the Nixon Library. Both fascinating places to learn about the two presidents.
Well, believe me, for my brother John and I, and my brother Peter also, the Reagan Library may be like Mecca to us. So, we're definitely going to check that out one of these days soon. Your first meeting with Ronald Reagan, were you starstruck by him? Was he instantly approachable? Well, you became very, very close, but how was that first meeting with him?
Well, that's another interesting story. I also met him at UCSB. I was student vice president my senior year at UCSB, and he was running for governor, and so I heard that he was going to be campaigning in Santa Barbara, and so I called up his campaign office and I said, "Gee, I see that Reagan's going to be speaking in Santa Barbara. What would you think about him coming over to the campus and speaking to the students?" And I got a call back, and they said, "Sure." And so there's a place on campus there, it's still there, called Campbell Hall, that seats about 800 or 900 people. And so Reagan came on over, and one of the privileges I had as student vice president was to introduce all the speakers. So Reagan came by, and I introduced him, and I still have in my files sitting here the introduction I made for him. So that's how I first met him as a 21-year-old back in 1966.
So before becoming a speechwriter, you were giving speeches yourself, and you've actually saved them?
I gave him the introductory speech, and so he liked the phrase I had. I said, just as I understand, just as you replace the old Ranger on television, now I understand you want to replace the old Ranger in Sacramento. And he really liked that line. Well, the old Ranger was the host on Death Valley Days.
That's right.
And Ronald Reagan took over as host for Death Valley Days, so he thought that was pretty clever.
That's funny. And,
then the next time we met him was in over New Year's 79-80, when I first began doing some research assistance for him. fact, I wasn't planning to be a speechwriter for him. I was hoping to be a research assistant in his 80 campaign, and didn't plan on writing speeches at all. And it was only when his campaign got in trouble in September of 1980 that my friend Stu Spencer said he needed a speechwriter on the plane and called me to help.
Yeah, and we're going to get to some of the speeches that you wrote for him. We're going to be right back after this. This is Ken Khachigian, speechwriter for President Nixon and President Ronald Reagan. We'll be right back after this on the Marc Kapetan Show. This is KMJ. News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome back to the Marc Kapetan Show. This is attorney Marc Kapetan, your host. Folks, we're going to get right back into it with Ken Khachigian, the speechwriter for President Reagan. Listen, I want you to remember one thing, though. If you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, or if you've been in an auto accident, a truck accident, or a motorcycle accident, give us a call at 559-498-8000. It's the Kapetan Brothers Law Firm. Again, if you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, or if you've been in an auto accident, give us a call, 559-498-Kapetan Brothers, 8000. I almost forgot the rest of the numbers. 559-498-8000, Kapetan Brothers. We are the Valley's Law Firm. Again, folks, we're on for the second hour of Ken Khachigian, who is the speechwriter for President Reagan and for President Nixon. Ken, you were the key speechwriter for his first inaugural address. He had just come out of the post-Vietnam era. Soaring inflation. There was low morale. I think it was 400 and something days of the hostages being held by the Iranians. Many people won't remember, but Reagan turned around the perception of Americans regarding America. His primary theme was American greatness, and he genuinely loved the country. How important was that first inaugural address, and what was your goal in setting the record straight for America? Well,
the important thing was that America's was just its spirit was just so low during the Carter years. We had inflation was at 12%, and at one point I think it reached 16-17%. Mortgage rates were in the 11-13% level.
Gas prices were through the roof.
Right, gas prices were through the roof. Unemployment was 7-9%. You know, everything was just the economy was in such horrible shape. And as you pointed out, we had our hostages taken in the Iranian embassy. They're being held, and America was just being humiliated across the world. We had planes that couldn't fly, ships that couldn't float, and so it was just a terrible time. And so America's spirit had to be lifted, and so that was one of the goals of the campaign. And but Reagan wanted to focus on two things. The economic recovery was absolutely critical. And we had to get inflation and down, and had to get control of the budget, which was way out of control. And we had to get taxes cut. He was committed to supply side economics and cutting taxes. But he also wanted America to feel like it was coming back, and then to lift its spirits. So to start what he called in the speech an era of renewal. And so that was the goal. And so when I was asked to, when I came back to California after the campaign, I didn't have any notion of going back to Washington at all. I was tired. I just wanted to get back to San Clemente, go to the beach, and be with my family.
Yeah.
And Jim Baker was appointed chief of staff and called me and offered me the job as chief speechwriter. And I said, I don't want to come back to Washington. he said, well, Reagan's going to call you. And then Reagan called me and offered me the job. And I said, Governor, I just can't do it again. But they said, well, won't you come back and at least temporarily, and would you work on the inaugural address? And I said, okay. When you're asked to write an inaugural address, what do you do?
I was about to say, is that where your sense of duty kicks in, where you say, okay, I may not be the candidate up there, or I may not be the politician up there, but I have a chance of basically reaching out to the millions of Americans with my personal words. Yes, they're going to be in the words of Ronald Reagan, but do you have that awe-inspiring moment where you sit there and say, oh my God, I'm going to make history in some sense?
When you grew up walking barefoot in the dust in Visalia and driving a tractor age 12 in a grape vineyard, and all of a sudden you're a son of immigrants, and you have a chance to write the first inaugural address of the President of the United States, what are you going to say? You're going to say maybe?
Yeah, I get it. No, I get it.
It's a chance of a lifetime, and to be able to work with the great communicator. But it was also scary, especially when you start reading the inaugural addresses of the past, and Abraham Lincoln's. When you get a chance, read his second inaugural address, and you'll say, "Oh my gosh, how can anybody write like that?"
Do you go back and do that? Do you have to? Is that part of your studies?
I read every one, starting with George Washington's all the way through.
Wow, no kidding.
I read every single one, and it was intimidating. But
because you have to rise to the level of that.
Level, and I asked for help from all my buddies. I asked for contributions. I wasn't ashamed. I asked for 8 or 9 or 10 pals to send in their contributions, and I shamelessly used a number of them.
What was the one great line, though, that you came up with or that you included in that speech where you said, this is going to make my mark vicariously through President Reagan, but this is going to make the mark?
Well, it actually wasn't mine, and I probably I don't want to take credit for anything or give credit to anything. Yeah. It was President Reagan's speech, so it's his inaugural address, and what he did was he took whatever words that we presented to him, and he rewrote most of that entire speech. He rewrote it on the airplane coming back from Washington. And as he said, he ran. When I got to meet with him, he said, I didn't quite finish it because the plane landed before I could finish.
That's how, we see these things, we think they're so well prepared, etc., and that's how off the cuff some of this stuff could be.
Well, there's a handwritten copy of it in his library. If you want to look.
Wow. Listen, you recall an encounter with Reagan where you had been talking to him after a Lincoln Memorial event that was earlier in the day, and he basically had tears in his eyes welling up as he was recounting the events of that Lincoln Memorial event that was there. Tell me what kind of sense you got from who that man was personally. He truly loved America, but he was emotional about it.
Well, there was a choir singing at the Lincoln Memorial, and it was during the inaugural events, and it was after a sort of a prayer event, and we were back at the Blair House, and we were looking at some of the final drafts of his inaugural address, and he was actually in bed having some tea and toast, and he asked me if I had gone to the events. Actually, the events were I think the evening before, actually. And I said no. I was up the night before working on the speech, And he said it was so patriotic, and then he started tearing up all over again.
Yeah.
He was he just loved he just loved America so much, and just the patriotism of it. And, Nixon was that way too. Actually, when the POWs came back from Vietnam, we had a great event on the South Lawn, and we had Irving Berlin came to sing "God Bless America."
Oh my gosh!
And that was quite an event.
Ken, you're going way back right there, Irving Berlin. Wow! Listen, we're going to be right back with Ken Khachigian. He was the presidential speechwriter for President Nixon and President Reagan. We'll be right back after this on the Marc Kapetan Show. This is KMJ. News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome back to the Marc Kapetan Show. Folks, we're going to get right back into it because we have a lot to talk about with Ken Khachigian. He was the presidential speechwriter for President Nixon and President Reagan. Kapetan Brothers, you guys know the drill. If you've been arrested or been in an accident, call the Kapetan Brothers at 559-498-8000. Kapetan Brothers, we are the Valley's law firm. Ken, listen, you can see how I'm rushing right back into it. So much to talk about with you. Last segment, Ken. So tell me your most important speech, or one of the most significant speeches you wrote for Reagan.
It was what was then called the Bitburg crisis. It was really the first personal crisis of the Reagan presidency, and I was not working for him full time. I was just in personal life, working on my law practice, and it was a personal crisis. And Mike Deaver his assistant called me to come back and help out because I think Mrs. Reagan asked him to get me back there. And what it was that he was going to go to Germany to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II, and they were going to lay a wreath on some graves of German soldiers. And it turned out that when the advancement went over, they were covered in snow, and it was the graves of German SS troops.
Oh boy!
Which caused a big furor here back in America, and they wanted him not to make this trip. So in order to end this controversy, just to sum this up, they determined he had to give a speech at a concentration camp. And they picked Bergen-Belsen. And they asked me to come back and write the speech at Bergen-Belsen. And so I flew back and spent 4 or 5 days working on this speech. And really, it was a critical speech because he was really under enormous pressure not to go. And it was one of his biographers, Edmund Morris, called it the best speech of his. I must say, it made me feel good.
Absolutely.
The presidency.
How much do you think you basically drew on your experience from your grandfather and your father with the Armenian genocide?
Actually, what triggered a lot of the language is that a friend of mine, I was back there in April and to write this, and a friend of mine on April. On a Sunday, said there was a genocide memorial service at Arlington Cemetery, and he came and said, Jim Rangillian was his name, and he bugged me. He says, "Come on, you need to go with me." And I said, "Jim, I'm working on the speech. I don't have time." He said, "No, you really need to go." And so I went with him, and all of a sudden I became very emotional, thinking about what happened to the Armenians during the genocide. And I went back, and it all got this entire inspiration in me, right, with language, and I poured my heart out into the language. So in talking about the Holocaust, I was really personally talking about the Armenian genocide. And so if you ever read that speech that he delivered in May of 85 about Bergen-Belsen, it was me, in fact, expressing my views about the Armenian genocide.
I was about to say, it's number one, we're going to post it on our Facebook, on the Kapetan Brothers Facebook page. I am going to go back and read that, because we were talking about ego, we were talking about personal feelings, aligning with presidential feelings. Basically, this is not only the speech of your career, but it is truly from the heart and truly part of your personal emotions coming out via the voice of Ronald Reagan.
Well, indeed, it was. Well, and it was important to him, and it was the one time. It was really the only time he ever called me up after a speech when he got back to the United States. It was that important to him.
Wow, good for you. The attempted assassination on Reagan, his great line, "I forgot to duck." I'm assuming that's Reagan in and of himself, but But does the speech writing team, where you said you were the fireman basically, how on was the speech writing team? Do you immediately mobilize? Do you have to write a speech of "I am fine, everything's going to be okay," and then also write the other speech for the vice president that says potentially "I'm taking over for the United States"? I mean,
I worked with the vice president on his speech that evening, and that was sort of a real crisis-oriented speech, because his own speechwriter, press secretary, that he asked to help him with his brief remarks to the press room, was having trouble under the stress and pressure of the time, and he said, "Geez, I'm having trouble doing this. Can you help me?" And so I grabbed, I talked to the VP for a couple of minutes, and then I grabbed the secretary's typewriter in the vice president's office and knocked out 2 or 3 paragraphs for the vice president and took it into him, and we talked about it. And then he went out and he edited it, and then it went out into the press room. But everybody was under intense pressure that day and feeling a lot of stress.
So in that moment, I mean, there was not, I had it written down as, was there a pause where everybody had a moment to reflect, etc.? But no, there wasn't a pause. There was basically stopped in their tracks, these people, just because of the emotion. They couldn't get through part of their job at that time.
Right. There was a lot of stress on everybody, and that was the time when I was in the Situation Room briefly before Al Haig went up to the press room.
Yeah.
And
made the mistake of calling himself the acting president of the United States.
I'm in control here.
Yeah.
A lot of this history that people aren't going to. I'm assuming people will know, I guess.
Yeah.
When I'm talking
the young people out there won't know, but yeah. Let me ask you this. Your best memory of Reagan, and I want you to sort of put it in not only your best memory, but also, was there a moment that you thought you knew everything about the world? You've written these great speeches, but that Reagan really taught you something, that there was something basically profound, that your relationship with him, which was somewhat close, really had an effect on you? Oh,
wow. You should have given me some time to think about that.
How about your best memory? How about the?
He wasn't somebody to get chummy with, but I will tell you one interesting memory I had with him, and that is he liked privacy when he was up the ranch, and when I went up there to work with him on his 88 convention speech, his farewell address to the convention, we had lunch, and then what he wanted to do, he wanted to show me his house, his little house that he worked on, and he it wasn't about anything else. He wanted to show me how he worked on the floor and how he put the floor in, and
by himself.
All by himself, and he wanted to show me his workmanship and things like that. And so it was just a real personal moment. And the other thing that was funny was, a more funny moment was when we were up at Camp David. He invited us up. I was working on the State of the Union speech. My wife and I were there, and he and Mrs. Reagan invited us to dinner, and we sat down, and he said, he offered us corned beef and cabbage. He says, I hope you like corned beef and cabbage. And I thought, oh my gosh. And to myself, my brain was saying, that's about the worst thing you could have asked me to eat. And of course I said, oh, I love corned beef and cabbage. I never get it at home. It's like, broccoli or something like that,
Well,
something
listen, we got a minute left here. You say that he wasn't chummy, but I see a lot of pictures that we're going to post on our Facebook page showing that you were very chummy with him. It seemed in many respects.
Well, when I say we had a really close, we were really close, and he confided in me. But his only real true friend was Mrs. Reagan.
Yeah, the love of his life. Yeah. Ken Khachigian, presidential speechwriter for Nixon and for Reagan. Great guy. You're working on your memoirs. We hope to see that in the near future. Ken, I appreciate you. Yeah, exactly. I hope you do too. Right. Hey, I appreciate you being on the show, Ken.
Sure, you bet.
We'll see you next week on the Marc Kapetan Show. This is KMJ.